one of the men tasked with guiding Palestinian Christians through these troubled times, is joining us from Bethlehem now. Reverend Munther Isaac, thank you for being here. On the news of Pope Francis's death, you wrote this on X. Palestinian and Palestinian Christians in particular have lost a dear friend today. Why was he such a friend to Palestinians in your eyes?
Yes, the loss of Pope Francis is a great loss, not just to all Christians, I would argue, but to all of humanity. He was a very beautiful soul, a genuine faith leader. To us Palestinians, I think what we will remember him for is that he saw through our pain and suffering. When he visited Bethlehem in 2014, the stop at the separation wall meant a lot. You have to understand the impact of this wall on the lives of Palestinians. Not just the fact that it separates us from Jerusalem, but the mental, spiritual impact of that wall, giving us literally that we live in an open air prison, conveying to us that we're not wanted, that we are marginalized on the other side of the wall. And typically many politicians or faith leaders come to Bethlehem and stop for 2-3 hours at the Church of the Nativity, do the prayer and leave. But for Pope Francis to stop the car and touch the wall and say that prayer, I think he touched more than just the wall. He touched the ugliness of the occupation, of apartheid. And more so, he touched our lives, our hearts, showing us that he saw through our pain and suffering. And I don't believe any of that was a stunt or just for publicity. I mean, think of what Pope Francis did throughout this war. On the one hand, there is the statements you shared, which I think are very extremely important. But at the same time, there is the pastor's heart, the fact that he cared to call almost on a daily basis the church in Gaza and check on them and was concerned about the details. Again, if this was just for some sort of publicity or a stunt, he might have called once a month and so on. But the fact that he called every day, I think, showed that he truly cared and that he wanted to be in solidarity with the Palestinians and in particular with the Palestinian Christians trapped inside the church. This is how we will remember him. And I think we can already see from the remarks of the Christians in Gaza, what they posted, what they said is that they will miss him because he used to call on them every day. I think he meant a lot to us here in Palestine.
You spoke of that moment that made global headlines where Pope Francis prayed at the wall separating Jerusalem and Bethlehem. You said it was not a stunt in your memory. Do you ever wonder what exactly he prayed at the wall in that famous moment?
Sometimes I wondered, I remember, but honestly, what he did meant more than the prayers he said or the words he said. I think the words he said will remain between him and his creator. But at the end of the day, what he did spoke a lot to us. I think I can easily sense what he was telling us Palestinians, that he sees our pain, that he understands our suffering, that he is in solidarity with us, that when we feel unseen, untouched, marginalized as Palestinians, and particularly as Palestinian Christians, he's telling us, I see you, I see your pain, I see your suffering. This is what meant more to us.
I see why that moment meant so much to Palestinians. Why do you think that it also made world news? This was a global headline. Why do you think it had such impact?
I think the Pope was known for these gestures, and the fact that it made headlines, I think media wants just any story. Sometimes this is what I feel. And more than the story that the media shared, I think there's so much about the hypocrisy behind those who share that story, yet forget about the situation, the occupation, the suffering of Palestinians the moment the Pope left. This is, I think, what we need to focus on. The fact that, the media followed the visit, everyone stopped, everyone took a picture, everyone spoke about the moment he touched the wall, but then we left and it went all to the same way of covering or even ignoring what's happening in Palestine. So it was an iconic moment, to be honest. The Pope praying at the wall. It was truly an iconic moment. But what gives us pain is the fact that all of this then becomes forgotten afterwards.
That wall has, of course, now outlived Pope Francis, and sadly his sickness and death coincided with the full-scale resumption of attacks on Gaza. Ultimately, do you think his solidarity with Palestine has had any impact on the state of affairs? Or, given his final calls have been for a ceasefire, do you hope that they will in the wake of his death?
Well, let me say two things. First, we will hear today, tomorrow, the coming week, words of tribute for Pope Francis from world leaders, from politicians. All of these words, in my opinion, many of them at least, just leak hypocrisy and, they're not genuine. Because had they been genuine, they would follow his example. They would care not just for a ceasefire, but for accountability. The quote you read from a book that he wrote, whether, that there needs to be an investigation, whether there needs to be whether the actions of Israel, the crimes of Israel amount to a genocide or not, in my opinion, are extremely important. But now everyone will pay tribute to Pope Francis and then put these words aside and put the fact that he said this is cruelty, this is terror, mentioning that experts saw in it as an act of genocide, and everyone will just forget that. It reminds me, by the way, of the tribute from all over the world when Desmond Tutu passed away, Archbishop South African Archbishop of Cape Town. The same thing, words of tribute. No one cared that he called the situation here as apartheid. And so this is what will, as I said, we will hear these words of tribute, but they will be leaking from hypocrisy. But I think that the second thing I want to emphasize is that the words of Pope Francis, I think, give credibility and legitimacy to many of us around the world. I think many grassroots movements, many faith leaders, many local parish priests, pastors, when they hear these words, they feel empowered and encouraged to speak truth to power in the same way he did, to have the courage to call things out for what they are. I think Pope Francis managed to shake this neutrality or diplomacy of the church. And this is the example he left for us. And I hope this is the example we will all follow, that we move beyond shallow calls for a ceasefire and calls for peace to language of accountability, calling war crimes by name, and emphasizing justice and dignity for all people. Because maybe that's, one of the most important legacies, the things he would left us, is the fact that he was able to humanize people from different contexts of marginalization and oppression, people who were dehumanized. He saw in them, he saw through them, and he saw the image of God in every individual and restored dignity. And to us Palestinians, that meant a lot.
A powerful legacy indeed. I want to get your reaction to some messaging that is coming out of Israel today. This is not the only response, but it is certainly a prominent one. Many have vocally celebrated Pope Francis's death, citing his support for Palestinians as a reason. For example, Zvika Klein, the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, condemned the Pope's, quote, unconditional support for Hamas. Others accuse him of anti-Semitism, of hating Judaism. What would you say to the people posting these messages?
It's shameful, truly shameful, especially given the life of Pope Francis and the effort, the investment he put to building bridges, to bringing people from different faiths together. His record of interfaith is, and speaks for itself. It's really shameful that accusations of anti-Semitism continue to be weaponized, even in an attempt, and no one can dare to do so, tarnish the reputation of a great man like Pope Francis. I think this is all part of the discourse of the Zionists to cast any solidarity with Palestinians as anti-Semitic, and the Pope was actually very genuine in his calls for the release of all the hostages. Again, he's not for one people group against the other. He's for humanity. He's for justice, and he's against war. And he clearly understood that war does not bring any results; it's only make things worse. Killing children is not the way forward. And so it's really sad and shameful that we hear such remarks about the legacy of a great man who genuinely cared for peace and wanted the well-being of all people living in this land.
I also find it difficult to read some of these comments. And, you spoke about how this was a pope who managed to humanize the most marginalized groups. I personally attended his sermon at the Vatican 12 years ago, his first ever sermon. And I remember this feeling that this was a new dawn for the faith. Now, of course, there's a new election. It's another crossroads for the church. And many are scared that the next pope won't share Pope Francis's reforms, his progressive views, his solidarity with minoritized groups, including the people of Palestine. Is this a concern that you share?
I think it's not appropriate to say this now. It's let's pray. Let's pray with the Catholic Church. Accompany them in their prayer so that God leads this moment and this process. That they choose the right person to lead the church in the coming years. It's a very difficult times we live in as a humanity. And honestly, I think what's really more important than all of this is that we all follow in his footsteps. We shouldn't just wait for the next pope or for the next archbishop to do so, when the example Pope Francis left us is an example that we can all follow. We can all walk in his footsteps, each in our own context. I think this concept of God's solidarity with the poor, with the marginalized, something we try to embody in our ministry as churches here in Palestine, I think should be the path forward. And recognizing, by the way, that Christianity today has become more than ever a global South phenomena, and faith leaders, Christian leaders from the global South, truly understand this element as a core element of what it means to be a Christian. To follow Jesus is to care for the poor, for the marginalized, to feed the hungry, to visit the prisoners, to defend the oppressed. And whether, rather than focusing on who's going to be the next pope, let's just pray. But more importantly, let's all follow in that example, and let's make sure that this becomes the characteristics of our faith as Christians, wherever it exists.
This news comes after a difficult weekend in Palestine for Christians. We've seen attacks on Christians in the West Bank by settlers. We've also seen worshippers being barred from accessing the holy site in Jerusalem. Is there anything that you wanted to say to those events?
Well, this Easter, in terms of Israel's actions in the old city of Jerusalem, it's been the worst, more worse than ever, in terms of limiting the number of worshippers who were able to enter the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to attend the very important Holy Saturday, Saturday of Light, Sept Nur celebration. It was really challenging, difficult to get to the church, and it's really hard to understand this oppression, this violence against people who just wanted to go to church. And as I said, this has been the worst year. So it seems that it's getting worse every year. In my opinion, the goal is clear, to emphasize that Israel, they want to strengthen their control over the old city of Jerusalem, including the holy sites. Let's remember, whenever we speak on this issue, that East Jerusalem is occupied by the international law. We should not just accept the annexation of East Jerusalem as a status quo. And at the same time, it's all an element maybe to limit Christian celebrations or festivals or feasts in Jerusalem to small events attended by few international monks, maybe without the presence of the indigenous local community. I think this is the plan. Clearly, this is the plan, so that to give Jerusalem only and exclusively a Jewish identity, rather than what we all hope for is Jerusalem to be a city shared by three religions and two peoples, in equality, in respect for one another, and in justice and dignity. And so the fact that whether it's Muslims trying to go to Al-Aqsa Mosque or Christians trying to go to pray on a Holy Saturday, what Israel is doing is really despicable. And I hope the world pays attention. It's a limit to our freedom. And Matala, I hope you understand. I'm not talking about that they prevented people from Bethlehem or Ramallah to go to Jerusalem. Well, we can't go anyway to Jerusalem. You know this. We need a special permit from the military. It's never easy to get. We shouldn't need a permit to go to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is our land. It's a twin city, for example, of Bethlehem. But at the same time, even the East Jerusalemites themselves were prevented from entering the church. I mean, just to think of the logic, you live in the place where this is the most holy maybe site for Christians, and you're not able to go to the church on one of the most important days of the year. Just think of the logic of that and how painful it is for us as Palestinian Christians.
Now, these events, this barring of people from the most holy site on one of the most holy days of the Christian calendar, has coincided with this really sad news of a much loved Pope. I wonder if you have given your congregation a sermon since his death, and if you would be happy to share with us that message that you sent them. What was the main thing that you wanted to communicate to your flock at this difficult time?
Pope Francis passed away on Monday, I think, the day after Easter. Easter reminds us of the triumph of life over death. And so we believe that he's passed away in glory and he's now with his Creator. But I haven't had the opportunity to preach to our congregation yet. I'll do so next Sunday. And touching on the legacy of Pope Francis, this is what I would say, is that we shouldn't look at Pope Francis as this, example who is hard to mimic, as someone who is holier than everyone above. Definitely he was special. I'm not denying that. But I think we should all try to follow his example. I think if we truly loved and were touched by the legacy of Pope Francis, by his ministry, by his teaching, by his preaching, by what he embodied, I think it's a calling to all of us, as I said, to care for our neighbors, to think of those marginalized, maybe in our neighborhood, maybe in our city, maybe in our family, to think of how can we bring a touch of compassion, be an instrument of God towards love, towards peace. This is the example of Jesus, and I think Pope Francis, a Jesuit, embodied true discipleship. By that I mean he was a disciple of Jesus. He tried to follow Jesus's teachings, and I think this is the example that we should all think of when we think of the legacy of Pope Francis, rather than making him like this faraway image of someone that no one can touch. I hope we bring him down to earth to think, imagine a world in which faith leaders or regular believers follow in the footsteps of Pope Francis. Let's imagine what our world will look like.
Reverend Munther Isaac, thank you for sharing those words with us and for joining us today.